In the next 3 years, this body of water will determine if your country goes to war. $5 trillion in trade flows through here every day. China just built military bases on islands that didn't exist a decade ago. The Philippines, Vietnam, and the United States are preparing for confrontation. And most people can't even find this place on a map. The South China Sea is about to change everything about your life, your money, your security, your future. Here's what nobody is telling you. Let's start with the raw numbers that make this place the most strategic body of water on Earth. 1/3 of global shipping passes through the South China Sea every single year. We're talking about $5 trillion in trade annually. Half of the world's merchant fleet tonnage sails through these waters. For perspective, if you close the South China Sea tomorrow, the global economy would face immediate catastrophe. Japan would run out of oil in weeks. South Korea's export economy would collapse. Europe's supply chains would snap like dry twigs. But here's what makes it even more critical. 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas lie beneath these contested waters. In an era where energy security determines national survival, whoever controls these resources controls the future. China imports 80% of its oil, and nearly all of it passes through the South China Sea. This isn't just valuable, this is existential. Now let's talk about what China has been doing, because this is where the story gets absolutely wild. Starting around 2014, China began one of the most audacious engineering projects in modern geopolitical history. They took reefs and sandbars that disappeared underwater at high tide and transformed them into military fortresses. We're not talking about small outposts. These are artificial islands with 10,000-foot runways, radar installations, missile batteries, and deep-water ports capable of supporting major warships. If you're amazed by our ancestors' story, why the South China Sea could decide the next global power shift, help us hit our 500-like goal. Drop a comment about your favorite fact and subscribe to join the Histo PH family. The Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, China built an entire archipelago of military bases in waters that 5 other countries claim as their own. Fiery Cross Reef, Subi Reef, Mischief Reef, these weren't islands before. They were underwater features. Now, they're unsinkable aircraft carriers, and they've fundamentally changed the strategic balance in the region. China justifies this with something called the 9-dash line, a maritime claim that covers roughly 90% of the South China Sea. This line first appeared on Chinese maps in 1947, and China insists it represents historical rights going back centuries. The problem? International law doesn't recognize historical claims over open ocean. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China's 9-dash line had no legal basis. China's response? They ignored it completely. They called it a piece of paper and continued building. Here's why that matters so much. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all have overlapping claims in the South China Sea based on international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This law says countries control waters within 200 nautical miles of their coastline, their exclusive economic zone. By that standard, most of the South China Sea should belong to the countries that actually border it, not to China, which sits far to the north. But China has created facts on the ground, or rather, facts on the water. When you have military bases, when you have Coast Guard vessels harassing fishing boats, when you have the ability to project power across an entire region, legal rulings become meaningless. This is the oldest rule in geopolitics. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and China is making sure it possesses these waters. Let's talk about what this looks like in practice, because the confrontations happening in the South China Sea are getting more dangerous every month. Chinese Coast Guard vessels, some displacing over 10,000 tons, larger than most countries' warships, routinely block and ram fishing boats from the Philippines and Vietnam. They use water cannons, they cut fishing nets, they chase vessels out of waters that international law says belong to those countries. In 2023, Chinese ships blocked Philippine vessels trying to resupply a grounded warship at Second Thomas Shoal, a reef within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Filipino sailors were injured. The incident brought the Philippines and China closer to armed conflict than at any point in decades. And this wasn't an isolated incident, it's a pattern. China is using gray zone tactics, aggressive actions below the threshold of war, to slowly squeeze other countries out of their own territorial waters. The United States has responded with something called freedom of navigation operations. American warships deliberately sail within 12 nautical miles of China's artificial islands to assert that these are international waters, not Chinese territory. These aren't casual patrols. These are heavily armed destroyers and cruisers sailing directly through waters China claims as sovereign. Every single time, Chinese military vessels shadow them. Radio warnings are exchanged, and the world holds its breath, hoping nobody makes a fatal miscalculation. Here's the deeper game being played. This isn't ultimately about fish or oil or even shipping lanes. This is about Taiwan. Look at a map. The South China Sea is the southern approach to Taiwan. If China controls the South China Sea completely, it can encircle Taiwan from the south while pressuring it from the west and north. It can cut off shipping routes, enforce a blockade, and make any American military intervention exponentially more difficult. Taiwan is the real prize. It's the world's leading producer of advanced semiconductors, the chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets to artificial intelligence. If China took control of Taiwan, it would control a choke point in the global technology supply chain more important than any oil pipeline. It would also break the first island chain, the ring of American allies and partners that has contained Chinese naval power since World War II. The South China Sea is the chessboard where this game plays out. Every artificial island, every confrontation with fishing boats, every freedom of navigation operation is a move in a larger strategy. China is building the infrastructure, military, legal, economic, to make a move on Taiwan feasible. The United States is trying to prove that it will defend the international order and its allies. That control of these waters is not a foregone conclusion. Now let's talk about the other countries caught in the middle, because their choices will determine how this ends. The Philippines recently made a pivotal decision. After years of trying to balance between the United States and China, after a president who openly courted Beijing, the Philippines has swung decisively back toward Washington. They've granted the United States access to 4 additional military bases, including sites facing the South China Sea and Taiwan. This is huge. It means American forces can operate from positions much closer to the contested waters. Vietnam is playing an even more complicated game. Vietnam and China fought a brutal border war in 1979, and historical enmity runs deep. Vietnam also has extensive claims in the South China Sea, and Chinese actions have damaged Vietnamese oil rigs and harassed Vietnamese fishermen. But Vietnam is communist, ideologically aligned with Beijing in some ways, and deeply suspicious of American intentions after the Vietnam War. So Vietnam builds up its own military, buys Russian submarines, harasses Chinese vessels when they intrude, but stops short of a full alliance with the United States. Malaysia and Brunei have been quieter, but they're not passive. They've expanded their own maritime patrols, protested Chinese incursions, and quietly deepened defense cooperation with outside powers. Nobody in Southeast Asia wants to choose between the United States and China, but China's aggression is forcing that choice. Here's what makes this a truly global issue, not just a regional dispute. The principle at stake is whether international law means anything. If a powerful country can simply ignore a legal ruling, build military bases in disputed waters, and use force to assert claims that have no legal standing, what stops this from happening everywhere? What stops Russia from claiming the Baltic Sea? What stops any strong country from bullying its weaker neighbors and redrawing maps by force? This is why Europe cares. This is why Canada, Australia, Japan, and South Korea care. This is why navies from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have started conducting their own freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. They recognize that if the international rules-based order collapses in Asia, it can collapse anywhere. The South China Sea is the test case for whether might makes right in the 21st century. So, what happens next? There are 3 scenarios, and none of them are comfortable. Scenario 1. The status quo continues. China keeps building, keeps harassing, keeps pushing, and everyone else pushes back just enough to avoid war, but not enough to reverse Chinese gains. This is a slow-motion victory for Beijing. In 10 years, the South China Sea is effectively a Chinese lake, and Taiwan's options narrow dramatically. Scenario 2. Escalation. A collision between ships, a miscommunication, a nationalist government in one country or another decides enough is enough.